Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to those of you that have managed to stick it out for 3 weeks, and hello to those of you that are new this evening, and it's lovely to have you along. As Trevor said, we have come to probably one of the most sensitive and difficult of life issues, the issue of suicide. Suicide is a tragic event, and many of us will have been left shocked or stunned by hearing of someone that we know that has taken their own life, and for some that will have come very close to home. Suicide is very difficult to understand, and there are no easy answers to this whole problem. But there are plenty of questions. How could it happen? What causes a suicide? And is there anything that I can do in response? And in the midst of it all, where can real hope be found? Well, those are some of the questions that we hope to tackle together this evening. Let's begin by looking at a few statistics. How common is death by suicide? Let's ask first of all, how often does suicide occur? In this country, suicide is the commonest cause of death amongst young people. It's more common, for example, than road traffic accidents, and of course you know how frequently we hear about road traffic accidents as a cause of death amongst the young. More common as well than cancer, which also can take away the life of young people. In Northern Ireland, a recent study showed that in 1 year, over 200 suicides could be expected. Now that's in a population of around about 1.7 million. And if you do your sums and average it all out, and of course it doesn't average out in a neat way in reality, but it would work out at an average of nearly 4 people every week committing suicide in Northern Ireland. Now that's the number of people actually completing suicide. The statistics would tell us that 10 times that number actually attempt suicide but don't succeed. So when we're looking at this whole issue and the scale of it, it would appear that we're looking at a number of people attempting suicide every day in this country. That's how big a problem we're facing. But what about the trends? Have there been any changes in the numbers of suicides over the years? Well, again, the statistics would tell us that the number of suicides has increased about 6-fold in the last 5 decades. So since around the 1950s or 60s, the number of suicides has increased by about 6-fold. And it would appear that that increase is greatest in the 15 to 29 age bracket. In other words, it's our young people in their late teens and throughout their 20s who are most vulnerable. And particularly young men. The suicide rate amongst young men has shot up considerably over these last number of decades. And that's an issue we'll come back to later in the talk. And so the question then really comes to us is why? Why does this happen? What kind of person in what kind of situation might be at risk of suicide? And as we try to answer that question, it will help us to build up some kind of picture to help us see those who are most at risk. And so what we're going to go on to do then is to look now just for a few minutes at what we call risk factors for suicide. In other words, these are factors that increase the risk that someone might take their own life. It's important to say that these are not necessarily causes. they just make it more likely that someone might take their life. In other words, to say that divorce is a risk factor for suicide doesn't mean that divorce causes suicide. Not everyone who divorces commits suicide. But amongst those who have committed suicide, there is a higher rate of divorce than in the general population. So we're going to look then for a few minutes at some of these, what we call risk factors, to help us build up a kind of a picture of the kind of person and the kind of situation that might be at risk. And as we go through these, I want you to try and think about what common themes there are in all of these factors. What kind of thread is there running through these factors? So let's go through some of them now. Does age play a part? And yes, the answer is that it does. And despite everything that we've said about young people increasing in the rate of suicide, actually the elderly can be at very great risk, especially those above 75 years of age. And again, whenever we think about it, this might be for a number of reasons. Illness, of course, your health begins to deteriorate. Bereavement, people around them and their spouse and those close to them are dying. And of course, we become more debilitated and frail as we get older. We're not able to do as much and we can become isolated. And a lot of those factors together might increase the risk. Are men and women different? Again, the answer is yes, that they are. Males are at greater risk of suicide than females by a ratio of about 3 to 1. 3 times as many men than women take their own life. And men also tend to use more violent means to take their life, things like firearms and hanging. What about marital status? Does being married affect risk? And again, we've mentioned already divorce. The divorced are at greater risk, and also the widowed, and then those who are single. And again, as we mentioned a few minutes ago with the elderly, the common factors there may be things like loneliness, loss, isolation, or even dashed hopes with regards to marriage. And I suppose the other side of that is that in some ways marriage is a protective factor for suicide, that within stable marriage there's greater support and stability, which itself can be protective. What about employment? Does having a job help? And again, it seems to be the case that unemployment is a risk factor. And again, we think about that, it may be that employment gives us a sense of purpose, something to get up for in the morning, and that is protective. Those that have retired are also at slightly greater risk. Living circumstances are important. We've already mentioned loneliness and isolation as being risk factors. What about this one? Religious people wouldn't commit suicide, true or false? Of course, the answer is that it's false. Even those who have religious beliefs do take their own life in certain situations. Interestingly, though, even the research has shown that those who have both a personal faith and who practice that faith, who put their religion into practice, appear to be protected somehow against suicide. And although the research looks at it in a very kind of mechanical way, I suppose that looking beyond that, it may be that what that's showing up is that it's those who have a real, I suppose, living faith, a faith that works itself out in their lives, seem somehow to have some protection in terms of taking their own life. It may also be, I think, that to come back to the whole thing about the increase in the rates over the last number of decades, it may well be that the lessening influence of religion in our society may have something to do with the fact that rates of suicide have increased. What about those that have tried before? Does your health count? Again, we've mentioned with regards to the elderly that painful, chronic conditions in particular may be risk factors for suicide. Let's come to this whole point of whether or not we've tried before, and does that increase risk? Well, the answer is yes, it does. Up to half of those who take their own lives have some history of deliberate self-harm, have harmed themselves in some way in the past. And it's an issue that we're going to come back to again in a moment or two and look at in a little more detail, because it is a very common problem. And then finally, do people who commit suicide have psychiatric problems? The answer is that mental disorders have a major impact on suicide risk. And again, some research that has been done locally in recent years showed that nearly 9 out of 10 victims had some kind of mental health problem. Now, whenever we talk about mental health problems, we mean mental health problems in the broadest possible sense, not just the more severe mental illnesses. What were some of those psychiatric issues? Well, one of the most major ones was alcohol abuse, and I suppose in a sense that doesn't come as a major surprise. Alcohol abuse, where there can be so many destructive effects of severe alcoholism in someone's life, so many losses and effects psychiatrically also. And again, in the setting of even alcohol intoxication, we're more likely to do things that we wouldn't normally do, things that are impulsive and out of character. So alcohol abuse was a major risk factor there. Depression, we talked about that last week, especially depression in the early stages, it seems. And it may well be that in the early stages of depression that's developing, a person is not quite sure what's going on. And they're trying to make sense of why there are these changes. They know they feel terrible, but they can't make sense of it all and put it all together, and they're confused, and it may well be that increases the risk of suicide in those stages. Another psychiatric illness that's relevant is manic depression. And a proportion of those who have manic depression, or what's sometimes called now bipolar illness, can also take their own lives. And then, of course, there are other illnesses like schizophrenia, which also increase the risk. So psychiatric illness and psychiatric problems in general are certainly risk factors. I wonder, as we've gone through then some of those, have you seen any kind of pattern? Have you seen any kind of common thread through them all? I think if you look behind them, what we do begin to see, at least in some kind of outline, is that a lot of those risk factors are related to some kind of disappointment. There's some kind of failed expectation, some shattering of hope, some area of life in which life has not lived up to its promises. Let's take, for example, marriage. In marriage, most couples, as they walk down the aisle, they have a certain expectation, don't they? A certain dream of what their marriage might turn out like. They expect happiness, they want comfort, they hope for a family if possible. Certainly on your wedding day, you're not expecting that this relationship will end up in divorce. And whenever that happens, then those initial hopes that you had are not fulfilled. They're dashed, they're lost. And we see that in some of these other risk factors in relation to things like our health, our work situation, our financial situation, and so on. I think that's the first common kind of factor and thread that we see in a lot of those factors. The other striking thing about them is that they're all normal experiences. Things that are part and parcel of life. They're things that we can't avoid. They're part of existence here, aren't they, in this life? We all grow old. We all face illness. We all experience loneliness at times. Now, I want you to hold that thought there then this evening about this pattern that there is to these risk factors for suicide, and we'll be touching on it again later. Let's shift now to look at this whole area of self-harm. self-harming. I don't know if any of you noticed, I just caught a glance of it, and I put it away and meant to then look at it again and didn't get a chance to. But there was an article within the last week on the BBC News website about the rates of self-harming amongst young people in the UK. And there has been some phenomenal increase in the rates of deliberate self-harm amongst young people within the last 5 years in the UK. And clearly this is a growing problem, a major problem which we can't ignore. What is self-harm? What do we mean by deliberate self-harm? Well, I suppose simply it's when someone injures or harms themselves on purpose rather than by accident. And that can happen in a number of different ways. Some of the ways that we see most commonly are things like overdosing, even just hitting themselves, cutting, a very common one, use of blades, for example, burning oneself. Sometimes you see people with lots of cigarette burns on their arms, pulling hair, picking skin, ligaturing or self-strangulation, creating ligatures, even swallowing things, swallowing dangerous objects. Those are some of the ways in which we see this whole deliberate self-harm manifesting itself. Normally those acts of self-harm are done in a state of very high emotion, and they can be very impulsive. And another aspect of this that we see is that it can become a very repetitive behaviour, almost like an addiction. We'll see in a moment why that might be. Again, the statistics would tell us that about 1 in 10 young people self-harm at some point in their lives. And again, whenever you think about, for example, the number of young people you may know, it's an amazing statistic. More common in young women. So whereas the suicide is more common in men, deliberate self-harm is more common in young women. And it's more likely to have happened in those that have suffered abuse. Now, it isn't always associated with abuse, but there is quite a strong association there. Now, why does it happen? Let's look at this first of all. Why do they do this? Well, for some it's a means of gaining control. Take a young person with some terrible problem, maybe it's something like abuse that they feel they can't talk about or can't share with someone, they're confused, and they begin to feel desperate. They don't know what to do about it. They don't know where to turn for help. And they can feel very trapped and very helpless. And it can seem as if things are out of control. And as well as coping with those feelings, the self-harming for them becomes some kind of thing that they have control over. And that sense of having control over this activity, over this behavior, is something that reinforces it. Another very common one there, secondly, another common reason that this happens is for relief of tension. Again, if we take that first situation, you can imagine someone who's come through that kind of experience is going to have all kinds of a turmoil of feelings going on in there, feelings of anger, feelings of tension, getting bottled up until they feel like they're about to explode. And there's then a relief of tension very often when they self-harm. And whenever you think about it, if you've got unpleasant feelings, then something that relieves it, whenever those unpleasant feelings build up again, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do the thing that relieves it. And that's part of the reason why it can become quite an addictive pattern, because it's the self-harm itself that itself brings the relief. For others, it's punishing self. There can be, again, perhaps in the situation of abuse, unbearable feelings of guilt or shame, or that could be in relation to anything that's going on in the young person's life, and they feel that somehow they need to punish themselves for that. And so this self-harming behavior becomes a way of doing that. For some, then, they also because they've come through something that's terrible and difficult and hard, some difficult experience like abuse or some other trauma, they begin to feel a kind of a numbness and a coldness in their lives. It's a way of coping with very, very difficult emotions. They try to block them out. They try to hold them down under the surface, and so they become numb and they become cold and they don't want to feel anything. And they try to convince themselves that these difficult events in their lives have never happened, because it's easier to deny them and easier to have feelings of deadness, and they feel detached from the world and detached from their own bodies. And then what happens is that they self-injure, and then they feel pain. And they maybe see blood, and it somehow brings them into the here and now again. They've been spending all this time trying to disconnect themselves from reality, but then they cut themselves, for example. It brings them into the here and now, and they begin to feel more connected again. And that very feeling of connection, or feeling alive, they sometimes will describe it as something that reinforces the cycle again. And for others there, finally, it is a way of attempting suicide. They harm themselves impulsively without thinking. They just want the problems to disappear, but they're confused. And for some, it is also trying to find a way out of life. That's why it happens. Well, just very briefly then, before we leave this subject, what can we do about it? Well, I think the first thing is to try and be vigilant, to notice if you're concerned about someone, to look for clues, to look for evidence that they may be harming themselves in some way. Secondly, there, encourage the person to talk. We've seen that usually there's a reason for it. There's something that has caused these difficult feelings and these destructive behaviors. So encourage talking, take them seriously, be sympathetic to whatever the problem is that they're discussing with you, and try to help them look constructively at the problems and solve them in ways that are less destructive. Ensure safety. Of course, it nearly goes without saying. It's something we would try to do instinctively, but be practical about how you might ensure safety. If you have to keep tablets or medicines at home, try to keep blister packs of medicines. It's been found that actually can be very protective, because sometimes what people will do in the impulse of the moment is, if there's a bottle of medications, they'll take a handful out of the bottle, whereas if tablets are in a blister pack, and you'll notice now that really whenever you're buying medicines over the counter now, that they do all come in blister packs, and the reason for that is that it's found that has been more protective for people who self-harm. It has to do with the fact that it takes more time to get the medications out, and that just seems to afford a person those few extra seconds to stop, take stock, and think about what they're doing. Keep medicines locked away is another thing. Get help if needed. Bring a person to the GP, go to the hospital if there are injuries, if a person is self-injured in some way. They may need that taken care of, dressed, for example, if it's a cut. See a doctor. Well, again, I've already mentioned that, and really anyone who has taken an overdose of any kind at all, or tried any attempt at suicide, really needs an urgent assessment by a doctor. Doesn't matter if they look okay and look fine. Some of the harmful effects of tablets that people will take can be delayed. One of the most common examples of that is paracetamol, where really it's hours afterwards that the paracetamol takes its effect upon the liver and damages the liver. So if someone just seems to be okay and doesn't look sick and looks fine, don't feel that they then don't need to be seen by a doctor. They may need treatment for that. And again, for any young person who's self-harming in any way, I think it's good to see some professional GP or some mental health practitioner to try and look at the problem, see if there are issues that need to be addressed, maybe family issues or other background issues. Is there depression or anxiety that needs to be treated? Or are there some of these difficult experiences in a person's background, like trauma or abuse, that needs to be talked through? And then finally, they're learning to cope with the feelings. We said that very often this self-harming can be because of the build-up of very difficult emotions. There are ways out there of trying to deal with those kind of difficult feelings in ways that are less destructive. Distraction techniques seems maybe like an obvious way, but people have found these useful things like going for a walk or a run, taking some physical exercise or activity, going for a hot bath or a cold shower, even something like that, and ways of feeling pain in ways that are less destructive. People sometimes find clenching ice cubes, for example, can help, or I've even seen the suggestion of taking a hot chili pepper. I've never actually spoken to anyone for whom that has worked, but it is one of those ways that's out there for people to feel a kind of a pain, but in a way that isn't destructive. So learning to cope with difficult feelings. So then that's the whole area of self-harming, and I thought it was important just to take a few minutes to look at that separately this evening. Let's change gear again slightly and look at this whole area then of what we can do. How might we help someone who is at risk? Perhaps you're worried about someone. Perhaps you know someone who's hinted at things that just leave you feeling uneasy, that make you worry. What ways can we deal with this? And I appreciate that not everybody will feel that they're in the position to help and to deal with some of these things and to talk about some of these things with someone. But if you're not, then find someone who is, and these principles may be helpful. First thing is, these are some do's and don'ts, by the way. The first thing is, don't be afraid to ask. Very often we are afraid that by even mentioning suicide to someone who's vulnerable, that we may put the idea into their heads, and that somehow we'll increase the risk by even mentioning the word. Well, to be honest, very often those that are running out of hope and who may be contemplating self-harm or even suicide are very relieved often to be able to share their burden. So don't be afraid to ask. The second point is don't panic. And don't be thrown off by another myth that's out there, which goes along the lines of those who talk about it never do it. And you'll have heard people say that those who talk about suicide never do it. Well, certainly there are people out there who for various reasons will often threaten suicide, and they never come to any significant harm. Equally, though, it is the case that there are those who do talk about it and who do complete suicide. And I suppose the question for you this evening is, well, how do we know? How can we tell the difference between someone who's just threatening but not really meaning it, and those then who really do mean it? Well, there are some who use the threat as a means of communication as to how they're feeling. They're feeling desperate about life, something's gone wrong, and they threaten suicide as a way of coping with that, sometimes to seek help and to seek attention from others to their problem. And I suppose the important thing there to do is to look beneath the surface and to ask, well, what is behind the threat? If there is someone who's constantly threatening to take their own life, what is it that's going on? What's driving that? What's the problem underneath here? Another way of trying to distinguish is to look for any changes. If you have someone who's constantly threatening suicide, and they come then the next time, there may be something different. Is there something different about the way they're presenting? Has there been some change in their circumstances or in their life at this stage that might place them at greater risk? And so try to ask some questions like that to look beneath the surface to try and distinguish between those who are just really crying for help and those who genuinely are suicidal. Don't ignore it, really, is what we have talked about there. And do be on the lookout for those in need. We've already mentioned a lot of the risk factors earlier this evening. Be on the lookout for those who are showing some of those risk factors. But remember what we said, that not everybody who, for example, is elderly or alone is necessarily going to be suicidal. So we have to be balanced in how we weigh all of that up. So do be on the lookout. Do offer practical help. If you're worried about someone, if they seem to be expressing some ideas of hopelessness, then do try to help them practically. Again, as we said last week with those who are depressed, it can be very hard, can't it, to just find the right words and the right things to say to people. Well, helping practically can be very important, and it can help you to engage the person and puts you in a position where you are helping them and where you can listen to them. If you put yourself in their shoes, it can be very threatening and difficult to be able to talk about some of these thoughts and ideas that they're having straight away. And so therefore, if you begin to help them practically, you're putting yourself in a position where you'll gain their confidence and where they'll feel more able to talk to you. So offer practical help. Do put safety first. And one of the key points I think to remember there is be wary of receiving any information in confidence. Be very wary of people who begin a sentence with, "Do you promise not to tell anybody?" Because if they go on then to express suicidal thoughts and intentions and plans to you, well, clearly you're going to have to share it. Clearly it's not something that you're going to be able to hold yourself or carry yourself. So be very wary of receiving any information in confidence. The individual's safety must be a priority. And if they talk about suicide to you, you will need to inform other people. So put safety first. And do encourage the person to seek help. Again, you may want to bring the family doctor on board there, or another relative, and then try to think of ways in which you can also help. Again, coming back to those risk factors earlier, we looked at some of the underlying causes, things like loneliness. Perhaps you can come in there, befriend and bring some company into their lives. Or if there's been a major life event that they're struggling to cope with, again, can you come in and help? And target your support to those points of need. And again, in a very acute situation where someone seems to be very acutely suicidal, they may need to stay with someone. That's a very practical thing, again, that you can do to help. Whenever then you're in that situation of being able to help someone, what exactly do you say? How on earth do you begin to ask someone about suicide? As we said at the very beginning, it's a very sensitive topic, not something that we're used to talking about in everyday conversation. How on earth do we begin to ask? Well, the first thing to say is that the best thing to begin with is by listening. You'll find that the appropriate responses and the appropriate words will come more easily if you've listened first, and if you've gained an understanding of this person and where they're at and why they're feeling the way they're feeling. Next then, begin gently. And one of the ways that we do that is by, first of all, asking very general and open questions. We don't dive straight in by asking directly about suicide. We begin gently. How are you feeling these days? How are things? How are you doing these days? How do you see the future? And then we begin to narrow it down a little bit, and we ask, does it ever get so difficult that it's hard to see a way forward? Do you ever feel that life is not worthwhile? And so you see that we begin with something very general, and then we begin to narrow it down slightly. And if you're beginning to get some positive responses to those questions, well, then we move on to things more specific at that point. So we move from the more general, open questions down to the specific. And we ask things like, well, have you ever thought about ending it all? Or have you ever felt like harming yourself? And if you're getting positive responses to those questions, well, then you really want to establish how real is the risk. Have they made plans? If so, how feasible and realistic are those plans? Could they carry them through? Is there access to the means that they're talking about using? Have they saved up tablets? Is there a firearm available in the home? And then we ask other questions, again, which may indicate that a person is genuinely thinking of really ending their life. Have they begun to sort out affairs? Have they looked at sorting out their financial affairs? Even for some people, it's things like, have they arranged the care of pets and things like that? And for others, then, it's what we call last acts. The writing of a note or a letter, the giving away of prized possessions. Those kinds of things may indicate that a person is genuinely thinking of ending it all. And again, we can also ask about those risk factors that we mentioned at the beginning. Finally then, don't take risks. If you're concerned, do address it either with the individual or by seeking the help of others. And finally, do encourage hope. Encourage the person that there is a way forward and that help is available no matter what the issue or the problem has been in a person's life. Okay, so we've looked then a little bit at what exactly we say to someone, how we begin to address the issue of suicidal risk with a person. We mentioned at the beginning that there has been a serious rise in the number of young people and young men in particular, and we want to just take a few minutes to ask the question, why should this be? Are there factors in young people in particular? Why are more young people committing suicide? Obviously, some of the factors that we mentioned earlier are relevant: divorce, unemployment, alcohol abuse, less religious commitment, and so on. But here are some of the more specific ones. Depression. Around 2 to 3% of adolescents get depressed. Now, for those that were here last week, the picture of depression in young people is slightly different than that in adults. We know that all of us, as we came through adolescence, and we went through phases of being moody and not very communicative. But for a young person who's struggling with depression, they become extremely moody and irritable. They begin to give up interests and they don't replace them with new ones. They lose interest in doing well at school or at their work. They find it hard to concentrate. They become withdrawn. They lose touch with their friends. They don't eat enough, or perhaps they eat too much. That pattern changes. They don't look after themselves in the way that they normally would. They can become very self-critical. Their sleeping may go off as well. And especially whenever those signs are out of character for that young person, especially when it's a change, we become concerned about depression. Why do young people get depressed? Well, again, there can be a family history, as we saw last week. Quite often there can be difficulties at home contributing to depression in a young person's life. Coldness at home, rejection, separation from parents. Other reasons can be things like abuse, we've mentioned already. Bereavement is an obvious one. Another common one it's worth mentioning is sexual difficulties. Young people struggling with their sexual identity. And today, a lot of young people are struggling with sexual feelings and sexual identity in a world, and indeed in a church, that itself is confused on these issues, and where young people can get very mixed and confusing messages and not very clear direction that can give rise to all kinds of conflicts and turmoil, which may lead to depression. Another reason that young people get depressed is a kind of a cultural thing. It's a bit hard to put your finger on this one and describe it exactly, but for some young people, for some groups of young people, there can be a culture of sort of pessimism and gloom and darkness. It can be reflected in a certain fashion, in a certain kind of music and appearance, sometimes linked with the whole kind of Gothic thing, also sometimes linked with the drug culture. And in a sense, depressed mood and kind of being depressed is part of that whole package. It's a culture in which famous people who have died at a young age by suicide are seen as icons. It's a culture in which there's a fascination with death and with dying. And it's a culture, I think, that is very much fueled and spread too by the sort of free access that young people have into it via the internet. And again, that article, the BBC article, mentioned about the access that young people have into websites that discuss suicide and self-harming in a very free and a very positive way. So there's a cultural element amongst young people as well to depression. And of course, this depression, when it develops, can leave them at greater risk of suicide. Family history, we've mentioned, a family history of suicide can leave a young person at greater risk. Life events, difficult life events. And for young people, the kind of life events that we mean are things like the breakup of a relationship, especially where that relationship has been a steady and even sexual relationship. That seems to be a particularly threatening thing for a young man whenever that kind of relationship breaks up. It may be to do with the emotional maturity that young men have at that stage. May just be because of the whole conflict and the loss of a relationship. Anger as well can be part of all of that. For some reason, it certainly leaves young men at greater risk. Other life events can be things like relationships with other people, like parents or school friends. Another important one to mention for young people is shameful, humiliating experiences. Those kinds of life events, failure at school, failure at work. It's one of those reasons, I think, where sometimes we hear about those very high achieving young students that go to Oxford and Cambridge. At some point through their studies, they take their own life. Very unexpectedly, someone who seems to have everything to live for, very gifted young people. And it may well be that for them, they're high achievers, they have high standards, and then any kind of failure is very catastrophic for them. Abuse and bullying are also important experiences that feed into life events that increase the risk here. And then another very important life event is the suicide of a friend or a relative. It's something that in the part of the world that I come from, County Armagh, sort of mid-Ulster area, that a few years ago we saw this spate of young people taking their own lives in the schools and colleges there. And it seemed to be that certainly this was an issue for them, that the life event of having lost another young person in their peer group created not just the grief of losing that person, but an anxiety and an insecurity amongst the rest of the peer group. And they would text one another and they would use the internet to in a sense, spread their concerns and their anxieties, and it causes a lot of insecurity amongst the young people. And so very important whenever a young person has taken their own life that the other young people in that peer group are supported. Another reason that the risk has increased greatly in young people is this whole area then of risky behaviours, particularly in the area of drug taking, using alcohol and sexual relationships. And it may well be that that reflects a more impulsive kind of young person who's going to react to life in a more extreme and impulsive way. Or it may well be that these are young people who are just, they're bored, they're disillusioned with life, and they're indulging in sex and drugs, and it's leaving them all at greater risk. And of course, whenever we do engage in use of alcohol and drugs, it does make us more disinhibited, more likely to act in ways that are out of character. Finally then, seeking help is that smaller one there over at the side. Young people are less likely to seek help, which again, of course, increases their risk. Young men in particular are less willing to attend their GP, and there have been, the last number of years, certain advertising campaigns to try and reduce the stigma for young men to go and seek help whenever they're feeling down or hopeless. Young men are more likely to view depression as feeling sorry for yourself, and I've just got to pick myself up here and get on with life. They're more likely to feel stigmatized by it all, and so they're less likely to go and ask for help. Let's just take a moment or two then to look at another whole area in relation to suicide, and that's for those that are left behind, the aftermath of suicide. People that have been bereaved by suicide are very often left with many questions. One of the main feelings that they get is guilt. They repeatedly look back, and that guilt can drive lots of questions. Could I have done something more? What if I had done this? The what ifs. What if this? What if that? Should I have seen it? Taken action? Maybe the person would have been here today if I had done something. Another feature of that bereavement can be anger. It shouldn't have happened. We are now left to pick up the pieces. The first thing to say is that those feelings and thoughts are very common and natural when you've been bereaved by suicide. And they can be very, very intense, and they can last for a time. But they are part of that whole process of reacting to loss that we call grief. They're not abnormal. They are to be expected. Now, bereavement by suicide, though, can be prolonged. What are some of the features of bereavement by suicide? But at the beginning, there can be a very intense shock. Very often, with grief, we do get a period of disbelief and of numbness. Well, whenever you've been bereaved by suicide, that shock can be very, very intense. It's a failure to take in what has happened. The mind just doesn't seem to be able to take in what has come to pass. An intense shock. Another feature of bereavement by suicide is a social isolation for those that are left behind, because very often there are feelings of stigma and feelings of shame for family and friends that are close. And that whole feeling of stigma can be very much reinforced because those around you very often don't know themselves how to respond. They don't know what to say to you. And because of that, then they feel awkward and they withdraw back, but it just leaves you feeling more isolated and more stigmatized by the whole experience. And a third feature of being bereaved by suicide is a prolonged search. A search for reasons, a search for explanations. Yet, no matter how much we try to analyze any given suicide, we can never truly know what finally makes a person take that step. If the long list of risk factors that we saw at the beginning of this evening tells us anything, it tells us that suicide is a very complex event and that it's likely to be a whole range of factors working together and acting together in a person's life that eventually leads to the act of suicide. And very often those that are left behind just come to accept that they can never fully know why the person did what they did. So what do you say to those who have been bereaved by suicide? Well, again, mentioned some of these things already. Try to understand, first of all, what those that have been bereaved might be feeling and what they might be thinking. Again, be a listening ear and offer practical support. And importantly, don't be tempted to try and give answers. Because very often, even those that are close to the victim can have very differing views as to the reasons for the suicide. And of course, we then come in, we give our thoughts, we give our view, and sometimes because it conflicts with what other people are thinking, it can lead to a strain on relationships during what is a very sensitive and difficult time. So don't be tempted to try and give answers. It will always live with those that have been bereaved by suicide, but for most, they come to some level of acceptance, and it's important for those that are around to try to bring hope. And that brings us then finally to the most important, I think, aspect of what we're considering this evening. We've looked at a whole possible range of risk factors for suicide, and we saw that very often it relates to disappointments, to losses, to hopes that have been dashed. And we have seen that things in this life that are meant to give us some hope and certainty and stability are at best uncertain and cannot be depended upon. And we've said too that it is difficult to know what was going through a person's mind in the weeks and days and even hours leading to a suicide. What I think, though, we can say, and it's true of all of those that have looked into this whole issue, is that at some point in time, this individual cannot see another way forward. They don't have any expectation that good will come to them. They can't look forward to anything. They have lost hope. Hope has run out. As I've done on other evenings, I want to finish by telling you about a group of people. This time it is a group of people who were suffering the hardships of this life. And if you had known these people, and if you were looking on, you might have thought that hope was running out for them. They had marital issues. Some had stress at work from difficult employers. Some were being haunted by skeletons in their past. Some were facing unfair public slander. And all of them, despite trying to live good, honest, decent lives, were facing bad things. Bad things just seemed to keep coming their way. And we read about them in the Bible, and the Apostle Peter wrote a letter to them. And in that letter he says an amazing thing. He says that even in the midst of such hardships, they were rejoicing. They were truly glad. I want to just read you a little extract from this letter, if I may, just a little bit from the introduction of Peter's letter to these people. And bear in mind, as I read these words, bear in mind, try to listen to them, and bear in mind the lives that these people were living and in the midst of. This is in chapter 1 of this letter. It says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable and undefiled and unfading, and is kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time." Listen to this. "In this you rejoice," he writes, "though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials." Now, the question that we can't avoid this evening is, why were these people so different? If they were suffering so much, facing so many disappointments, so much so that Peter, in those words that we read together from the letter, Peter says that it was grieving them, and there's hardly a more difficult or more painful emotion than grief. How come that there is no hint that their hope was running out? What made these people different from the majority of society today? Well, what made them different, Peter says there in that little section, he says, was that they had a living hope. They had a living hope. There was something ahead of them. You see, this world, with all of its pressures and disappointments and losses, was not where these people belonged. The hardships that they were facing were not their home. The bereavements, the illness, the frailty, the depression, the relationship problems, the shameful, humiliating experiences, none of that was their home. They knew that those things were not their inheritance. Yes, things were bad for them in the present. Peter's realistic about that. He isn't trying to sugarcoat that. He isn't trying to gloss over that. Things were bad. These were trials. These were real hardships. But these people were confident that things would get better, that good was coming to them. And it wasn't just wishful thinking. It wasn't just what we think of as hope today, that kind of trying to visualize the future in a positive way. These people were sure, absolutely confident, real, cast iron, guaranteed hope. The kind of hope that doesn't run out. And that's why when the grief and the pain and the distress and the loss came their way, they could still have joy. They were suffering, but they weren't rejoicing in their suffering. They were rejoicing in their hope. And the question this evening is, what about you? Ask yourself this evening, ask yourself honestly, what am I hoping in? It's not a question that we often stop to think about and ask ourselves, and yet there's hardly a more important question that we could ask. Are you sure that good will come your way? Do you have hope? Not hope in that wishy-washy, uncertain, doubtful way like, I hope it'll be sunny tomorrow. Not that kind of hope, that everything will turn out okay in the end. But have you the kind of hope that God gives? A confident hope. A hope that's certain of the good that will come. And certain because God has said it. The inheritance that Peter talks about there, that the future that we read of there, God has promised it. And his word cannot fail. And the wonderful thing for us here this evening, tonight, is that we can know this hope as a reality, a living reality in our lives, by turning around and banking everything on Jesus Christ and putting all of our trust in him. And in him we find a hope that will never run out. Thank you very much.